I am Julian Kensington. I am 28 years old, and last Thanksgiving, my own father looked me dead in the eye and publicly stripped away my entire inheritance in front of our extended family. While I was sitting there quietly at the end of the dining table, my parents proudly handed over prime real estate deeds and massive trust funds to my older brother and sister. Then, my dad turned his attention to me, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. He said, "You are not getting a single dollar until you stop playing with delivery vans and get a real job." They actually laughed at me. My own flesh and blood chuckled as I was humiliated in front of 30 people. But there was one thing they didn't know. My phone was sitting right there in my pocket, about to ring with a call from my chief operating officer. That call would confirm a $40 million wire transfer from SoftBank, officially making me the CEO of a tech company valued at $100 million. And now, my family is desperately begging for a seat at the very table they banned me from. Before I tell you exactly how I shattered their perfect, arrogant little world, hit that like button if you believe in karma and true justice. And please, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare really began. The Kensington family dining room was something out of a high-end architectural magazine. It was the kind of room that smelled like old money, lemon polish, and suffocating expectations. We were gathered at our coastal Maine estate for the annual Thanksgiving dinner. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the massive mahogany table that had been in our family for 4 generations. Heavy silverware clinked against fine bone china. The roasted turkey, the expensive Bordeaux wine, the perfectly arranged seasonal floral centerpieces. It was all a beautifully staged play, and we were all just actors expected to hit our marks perfectly. I was seated near the far end of the table, exactly where the family disappointment belongs. My older brother, Arthur, sat at my father's right hand. Arthur was the golden boy. He was a hotshot corporate lawyer gearing up for a highly publicized congressional run. He wore a custom-tailored Italian suit and a heavy gold Rolex that caught the light every time he reached for his wine glass. Across from him sat my sister, Beatrice. Beatrice was a high-powered political communications director who treated every single family gathering like a televised press briefing. She wore an elegant pearl necklace and a silk dress that probably cost more than my entire first year's salary. My parents beamed at them with unapologetic adoration. They spoke the Kensington language of power, legacy, aggressive ambition, and flawless public image. And then there was me. I was the guy wearing a simple, off-the-rack navy button-down shirt, having driven 4 grueling hours through a sleet storm in a 10-year-old Honda Civic. I had parked my rusted, rattling sedan far away from Arthur's gleaming black Porsche 911, so it would not ruin the aesthetic of the circular driveway. I did not fit in. I never did. Halfway through the main course, my father cleared his throat. It was a sharp, commanding sound that instantly silenced the entire room. Relatives stopped chewing. Aunts and uncles set their forks down simultaneously. My father dabbed his mouth deliberately with a linen napkin, stood up slowly, and picked up his crystal wine glass. He announced, in his booming courtroom voice, that it was time to discuss the restructuring of the family assets and the official distribution of the inheritance. He started with Arthur, naturally. My father proudly stated that the sprawling Nantucket vacation property and a significant portion of the family's aggressive stock portfolio would be officially transferred to Arthur's name by the end of the year to support his upcoming political campaign. Arthur smiled humbly, a perfectly practiced expression, and raised his glass to the room. The relatives clapped enthusiastically. Next was Beatrice. My father announced that her massive education fund, which she had barely touched due to her full scholarships, had been converted into a high-yield real estate trust. He officially handed her full control of the trust, along with a hefty cash injection for her rapidly expanding public relations firm. Everyone clapped again. Beatrice blew a kiss to our parents. It was a sickening, orchestrated display of wealth and blatant favoritism. I kept my eyes firmly fixed on my plate, methodically cutting a piece of roasted meat I had absolutely no intention of eating. I knew exactly what was coming next. This was the moment they had been building up to all evening. My father slowly turned his gaze toward the end of the table. The warmth in his eyes vanished completely, replaced by a cold, calculating, deeply analytical stare. The room went perfectly, uncomfortably still. He spoke in that low, diplomatic tone he reserved for delivering devastating news to an opposing counsel. He stated that he and my mother had decided it was best to withhold any major financial allocations for me. He called it a temporary pause. He claimed it was for my own good, to motivate me to find a stable, visible professional path instead of wasting my life in warehouses. Beatrice immediately chimed in, swirling her expensive wine, stating that startups were simply too risky and the family could not afford to throw good money into a black hole of poor decisions. Arthur nodded in solemn agreement, adding that my work wasn't public enough for their financial advisors to properly evaluate. They were talking about me as if I was a toxic asset, a bad investment that needed to be written off, rather than a son sitting 3 feet away from them. I placed my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. The clink echoed loudly. I looked my father right in the eye and asked him to clarify his statement for the entire room. I asked him, point blank, if he was formally cutting me off from the family trust simply because I refused to follow his exact corporate template. My mother quickly leaned forward, nervously twisting her massive diamond wedding band, claiming this was not a punishment, but a necessary reality check to help me grow up. I did not yell. I did not flip the table. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I simply smiled, a cold, hard smile, and said I understood perfectly. Right at that exact second, my phone buzzed violently against my thigh. It buzzed again, and a third time in rapid succession. It was my emergency work line. I pulled the phone out of my pocket. The bright screen illuminated the dim room. The caller ID flashed, Marcus Urgent. Marcus was my chief operating officer. He knew the incredibly strict rules about calling me during family events. If he was calling me right now multiple times, the world was either completely ending, or we had just officially conquered it. I pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. My father let out a sharp, annoyed breath, openly criticizing my lack of basic dining etiquette and demanding I sit back down. But I ignored him completely. I pressed the phone to my ear, right there in the middle of the silent, judging dining room. Marcus didn't even bother saying hello. His voice came through the phone speaker loud, crisp, and incredibly clear, cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a razor blade. He shouted that SoftBank had just confirmed the $40 million wire. He said the funds were officially sitting in our corporate account. He announced that the pre-IPO valuation of $100 million was completely locked in and legally binding. And then he loudly called me CEO. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second. The words echoed off the mahogany walls and the crystal glasses. I could physically feel the eyes of 30 wealthy, arrogant relatives burning directly into the side of my face. My father's wine glass stopped halfway to his open mouth. Beatrice dropped her heavy silver fork onto her plate with a loud crash. Arthur stared at me, his jaw slightly unhinged, trying to process the numbers he had just heard. I told Marcus, keeping my voice absolutely steady, that it was fantastic news and instructed him to schedule a global team call for the very first thing in the morning. I hung up the phone, slid it slowly back into my pocket, and sat back down in my chair. The silence in that room was absolute. It was a living, breathing thing. It was thick enough to cut with a knife. I looked at my family, my $100 million secret finally out in the open, and I realized something profound. I did not care about their money anymore. I cared about the decades of disrespect, the isolation, and the cruelty that led us to this exact moment. Because to truly understand the absolute perfection of their stunned, horrified faces, you have to understand the sheer, agonizing hell they put me through to get here. Growing up as a Kensington meant you were essentially a high-end product on a display shelf, constantly being measured, polished, tested, and appraised. Unconditional love was not a concept that existed in our massive house. Love was a highly restricted currency, strictly distributed based on your latest academic achievements, your standardized test scores, and the social prestige of the people you associated with on the weekends. From the day Arthur could walk and talk, he was the undisputed golden child. He was aggressive, loud, fiercely competitive, and incredibly charismatic. By the time he was a freshman in high school, he was winning national debate championships and shaking hands with local state politicians at exclusive country club mixers. When Arthur received his acceptance letter to Harvard Law School, my father was so ecstatic he immediately drove him to a luxury dealership and bought him a brand new Porsche 911 in cash. I clearly remember standing on the front porch in the freezing cold, watching Arthur aggressively rev the engine in our driveway while my parents stood beside him, clapping and cheering as if he had just cured a major disease. I was an entirely different species. I hated the spotlight. I despised wearing stiff suits or arguing for sport in a crowded courtroom. I was deeply fascinated by systems. I liked figuring out exactly how broken things could be systematically fixed. While Arthur was out networking at yacht clubs, I was usually hidden away in the dusty, poorly lit back corner of our massive garage. I spent my teenage years taking apart old computers, building crude inventory tracking apps, and mapping out complex logistics delivery routes just for the sheer intellectual thrill of it. My parents looked at me like I was a diseased stray animal they were forced to house. To them, manual labor or anything resembling technical engineering was strictly for the hired working class, not a Kensington. My mother used to introduce me to her wealthy socialite friends with a tight, terribly apologetic smile. She would force a laugh and say, "This is Julian. He is still trying to find his footing in the world." I was 18 years old with a flawless academic record, but because my goals did not align with a prestigious Ivy League law degree or a run for public office, I was officially branded a failure. The true, devastating depth of my isolation finally hit me on the day of my college graduation from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Earning a dual degree in systems engineering and applied analytics from MIT is no small feat. I had spent 4 grueling years grinding through brutal, sleep-deprived nights, writing complex predictive models, and publishing a thesis on route optimization. I graduated at the very top of my class. As I sat in the massive, crowded auditorium, surrounded by thousands of cheering families waving signs and flowers, I kept looking up at the VIP balcony section. I waited. I watched the heavy wooden doors. I kept checking my phone screen until the battery almost died. When the dean finally called my name, I walked across the stage. I gripped my diploma hard. I smiled for the professional cameras. And when I looked up at the specific section where my family had promised to sit, it was completely, undeniably empty. 5 empty chairs in a sea of celebration. 2 hours later, standing completely alone in the humid parking lot holding my hard-earned diploma, my phone finally buzzed. I received a brief text message from my mother. It was a high-resolution picture of her holding a glass of champagne at a luxury real estate gala in Martha's Vineyard. The caption read, "So proud of you, Julian. Wish we could be there, but your father had to finalize a massive commercial property deal. Let's do a quick dinner next month." I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone. I just felt a cold, hard, permanent knot form deep in my stomach. That was the exact moment the desperate boy who wanted his parents' approval died forever. I realized with absolute clarity that I was entirely on my own in this world. After graduation, I completely rejected the idea of working for a prestigious, shiny tech giant in Silicon Valley. I desperately wanted to understand the gritty, chaotic reality of ground-level supply chains. I took a low-paying, exhausting job at a mid-sized logistics firm in Ohio. During this incredibly lonely time, I reconnected with an old college acquaintance named Leo. Leo was a fast-talking, highly charismatic business major. We started spending our weekends sitting in a greasy, run-down local diner, drinking terrible black coffee, and meticulously sketching out an idea I had been developing for years. It was an advanced artificial intelligence algorithm designed to predict and automatically reroute last-mile delivery trucks during severe weather events or sudden traffic disruptions. I named the prototype SwiftRoute. I wrote every single line of code myself. I built the entire database structure. I designed the user interface. Leo was simply supposed to use his business degree to help me pitch the finished product to local delivery companies and handle the marketing materials. I trusted him completely. I thought he was my brother in the trenches. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I logged into our shared cloud drive to update the core routing parameters before a major test run. The main folder was completely empty. The backup files were deleted. My stomach instantly dropped to the floor. I frantically dialed Leo's number. It went straight to a disconnected voicemail. I drove through the pouring rain to his apartment complex. The landlord told me he had cleared out all his belongings in the middle of the night. 2 agonizing days later, I received a thick, certified letter in the mail. It was from a massive, terrifyingly expensive corporate law firm representing a major logistics competitor. The letter was a formal cease and desist order. It legally stated that their corporate client had formally purchased the exclusive proprietary rights to a predictive routing software. Leo had taken my entire source code, registered the intellectual property under a fake shell LLC in his own name, and sold my life's work for a massive payout. I was entirely devastated. I had barely enough money in my checking account to buy groceries, let alone hire a lawyer to fight a multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuit. I sat on the cold hardwood floor of my tiny apartment, staring blankly at the peeling paint on the wall, feeling a level of raw betrayal that literally made me physically sick. First my own blood family abandoned me, and now the one friend I trusted stabbed me in the back for cash. The universe was repeatedly telling me I was nothing but a stepping stone for other people's success. I spiraled into a deep, paralyzing depression. I stopped writing code. I stopped trying to build anything. I just needed to pay my rent to avoid eviction, so I walked 3 blocks down the street and applied for a minimum wage job at a small, struggling independent flower shop owned by a sweet, elderly woman named Mrs. Higgins. Mrs. Higgins didn't care about my MIT degrees or my shattered ambitions. She just needed someone physically strong enough to unload heavy bags of soil, haul fertilizer, and try to organize her completely chaotic, failing delivery schedule. Her shop was a logistical disaster. Expensive wedding bouquets were constantly dying in the back of her rusted delivery van because her driver took horribly inefficient routes across the congested city. I spent my grueling days smelling like damp earth, crushed lilies, and cheap chemical bleach. My family, upon hearing of my new employment status, thought I had completely lost my mind. When Beatrice found out I was hauling dirt at a flower shop, she actually had her assistant email me a link to an elite psychiatric evaluation clinic, claiming my erratic behavior was becoming a public embarrassment to the pristine Kensington name. But Mrs. Higgins was different. She actually paid attention. She noticed me sitting on overturned buckets in the alleyway, aggressively sketching complex routing diagrams on the back of old, crumpled receipts. She brought me a cup of hot chamomile tea one freezing afternoon, looked down at my messy mathematical notes, and asked me exactly what I was trying to build. I looked at her kind, wrinkled face and told her I could fix her entire delivery problem. I told her I could build a custom system that would cut her fuel costs in half and guarantee every single flower arrived perfectly fresh. She didn't laugh at me. She didn't ask for a 60-page business plan or a corporate resume. She just walked over to her ancient cash register, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, handed it directly to me and said, "I believe you, Julian. Buy whatever server space you need to make it happen." That $50 bill fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life. I went back to coding with a vengeance. I rebuilt SwiftRoute entirely from scratch, utilizing completely new architecture, making it 10 times faster, smarter, and far more aggressive than the basic version Leo had stolen. I implemented it at the flower shop the following month. Within 90 days, Mrs. Higgins' profit margins skyrocketed to numbers she hadn't seen in 20 years. I finally had my bulletproof proof of concept. I had my weapon. The fire inside me was roaring again, and this time, I wasn't building anything to desperately impress my family. I was building an empire in the shadows for myself. But just as I was gaining incredible momentum, I discovered a dark family secret that proved my blood relatives' cruelty ran far deeper and far more malicious than I ever could have imagined. I thought the worst of the pain was over. I was so incredibly wrong. The monumental breakthrough for SwiftRoute did not happen overnight in some glamorous, glass-walled office. It was built on a grueling foundation of cheap instant ramen noodles, permanently bloodshot eyes, and relentless, soul-crushing corporate rejection. During a local tech networking event, I partnered with Marcus. Marcus was a brilliant, razor-sharp operations specialist who possessed exactly the same massive chip on his shoulder that I did. We pooled our meager savings and rented a windowless, concrete warehouse space on the absolute worst outskirts of the city. We didn't even have functional heating during the brutal winter months. We wore heavy winter coats, fingerless gloves, and thick beanies at our cheap folding desks, grinding out complex code and logistical infrastructure for 18 hours a day. We were exhausted, broke, but intensely driven. As we were finally scaling the business and approaching our first major operational milestone, the holiday season rolled around once again. For the past 3 consecutive years, I had mysteriously not received a single formal invitation to the extravagant Kensington Family Summer Gala, the annual charity auction, or the massive Thanksgiving dinner. When I reluctantly asked my mother about this isolation during our rare, extremely brief phone calls, she would let out a dramatic sigh and blame the postal service. Or worse, she would use that sickly sweet, condescending voice and say, "Oh, Julian, darling, it was a highly formal black tie event. You wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway in your work boots and flannel shirts." I accepted her pathetic excuses. I honestly thought I was simply an afterthought, a minor inconvenience they occasionally forgot to include. But one late evening, while aggressively upgrading our company's internal cybersecurity protocols, I ran a routine diagnostic check on my personal email server. I noticed a blocked spam filter constantly catching automated messages from Beatrice's high-end public relations firm. I opened the back-end server logs to adjust the security settings, and what I found hidden in the digital footprints made my blood run entirely, terrifyingly cold. Beatrice, my own flesh and blood sister, was the sole person in charge of managing the digital guest lists and coordinating the invitations for all the Kensington family events. I dug deep into the email headers, bypassed the basic encryption, and meticulously cross-referenced the IP addresses. The data told a horrifying story. For 3 consecutive years, Beatrice had intentionally, maliciously altered my contact information in the master family database. She deliberately changed one single letter in my primary email address so every digital invite would bounce back. She manually changed the zip code on my physical mailing address so every paper invitation would be permanently lost in the mail system. She made absolutely, mathematically sure that I would never receive a single notification. And when the extended family occasionally asked where Julian was during these grand events, she played the role of the sad, innocent sister. She claimed she had reached out multiple times, exhausted every avenue, but I was just too busy playing in warehouses or too rebellious to show up and support the family. I sat frozen in my cheap, squeaky office chair, staring at the glowing lines of data on my monitor. The realization hit me like a physical, heavy punch directly to the chest. They didn't just casually forget about me. They didn't just overlook my existence. Beatrice had actively, methodically, and maliciously erased me from the entire family narrative because my existence as a struggling tech entrepreneur did not fit the pristine, wealthy image she was desperately trying to sell to Arthur's elite political donors. I was a stain on the perfect Kensington brand, and she ruthlessly scrubbed me out. I gripped the cold metal edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned stark white. Anger is a very funny thing. When it's hot, it makes you scream, throw things, and act recklessly. But when it turns ice cold, it gives you a terrifying, laser-focused level of clarity. I didn't pick up the phone to scream at her. I didn't confront my parents. I channeled every single ounce of that pure, unadulterated rage directly into the foundation of my company. Marcus and I officially went to war. We stopped wasting our time pitching to small local delivery companies and aimed our sights straight for the absolute top of the industry. We targeted the massive, highly complex national medical supply chain. Hospitals and emergency clinics were losing millions of dollars, and more importantly, jeopardizing human lives, because critical medical equipment, temperature-sensitive vaccines, and organ transport vehicles were getting constantly delayed in unpredictable traffic grids and severe weather. We secured a meeting and confidently walked into the intimidating boardroom of the largest medical logistics firm on the East Coast. We were two young guys wearing cheap, off-the-rack suits, pitching our software against massive corporate tech giants. We didn't use flashy marketing buzzwords. We pulled up our raw data. We showed their executives exactly how SwiftRoute operated in live, real-time crisis scenarios. We mathematically proved that our AI algorithm could instantly reduce their critical delivery failure rates by a staggering 32%. When the imposing CEO of that medical firm finally slammed his pen down and signed our first multi-year enterprise contract, I walked out of that massive glass building, looked at Marcus in the parking lot, and realized we had just officially hit our first $1 million in annual recurring revenue. From that exact moment on, we were an unstoppable, aggressive force in the market. We rapidly expanded our operations into 27 different states. We secured hundreds of massive distribution partners. The elite venture capital firms in Silicon Valley started circling our company like bloodthirsty sharks, practically begging to throw millions of dollars at our feet. We were in the final, grueling stages of negotiating a massive Series B funding round with SoftBank, preparing our corporate structure for a trajectory that would inevitably lead to a blockbuster, billion-dollar IPO. I was wealthy. I was powerful. I had a massive staff, but absolutely nobody outside of my immediate, highly secretive tech industry knew my name, and my treacherous family certainly had absolutely no clue about my monumental success. I purposely kept my old, rattling 10-year-old Honda Civic. I continued living in the exact same modest, one-bedroom apartment. I wore the exact same plain, inexpensive clothes. Then, exactly 2 weeks before the holiday, the heavy, cream-colored, wax-sealed envelope arrived in my rusted mailbox. It was a formal, legally worded summons. The return address was the headquarters of my father's elite corporate law firm. It was an ironclad invitation to the annual Thanksgiving family meeting at the Maine estate. The letter explicitly stated that attendance was strictly mandatory, as my father, acting as the primary executor, would be executing the final distribution of the family's trust funds, lucrative real estate holdings, and remaining college fund residuals. I tossed the heavy letter onto our warehouse conference table with a look of pure disgust. I told Marcus I wasn't going. I told him I was completely done playing their twisted, toxic psychological games. Marcus slowly leaned back against a humming stack of server racks, firmly crossing his arms. He looked at me with that sharp, highly analytical gaze that made him such a brilliant COO. He said, "Julian, listen to me. We are closing a $40 million funding round this Friday. You are about to be featured heavily on the cover of Forbes magazine. If you don't go back there and face those monsters right now, you will carry their heavy ghosts with you into every single corporate boardroom for the rest of your life. Go to Maine. Let them show you exactly who they are one last time. Let them dig their own graves. And then you burn the bridge to the ground." He was absolutely right. I couldn't move forward and lead a $100 million empire until I definitively, permanently closed the heavy door on my traumatic past. I needed to look them directly in the eye, not as the scared, rejected kid desperate for their validation, but as the powerful man who built a massive empire without a single dime of their dirty inheritance. I packed a small, cheap canvas overnight bag. I put on my usual inexpensive navy button-down shirt. I walked right past the luxury car dealership down the street, got into my rattling, dented Honda Civic, and started the long, brutal drive up the dark coast to Maine. A massive winter storm was brewing on the horizon, but I was driving straight into the absolute eye of it. The freezing gravel crunched aggressively beneath the worn, balding tires of my Honda Civic as I slowly pulled through the towering, ornate iron gates of the Kensington estate. The property was a sprawling, historically protected colonial mansion sitting ominously on a rocky cliff overlooking the gray, churning, violent Atlantic Ocean. It looked exactly the same as it did when I was a terrified child, cold, imposing, and completely, utterly unwelcoming. I navigated the long, sweeping circular driveway and intentionally parked my battered car right next to the entrance. Right next to my rusted sedan sat Arthur's newest expensive toy, a sleek, gleaming, midnight black Porsche 911. Behind it was Beatrice's custom-imported, pristine white Range Rover. The visual contrast was almost comical. My car looked like a piece of industrial trash that had accidentally blown onto a billionaire's perfectly manicured lawn. I took a deep, steadying breath, killed the rattling engine, and stepped out into the freezing, biting wind. I walked up the grand marble steps, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and pushed open the massive oak doors. The grand foyer was instantly alive with the sound of a live string quartet, the constant clinking of expensive crystal champagne flutes, and the hollow, booming, fake laughter of wealthy people aggressively congratulating themselves on their own existence. I handed my cheap, worn winter coat to the impeccably dressed hired staff and stepped directly into the main living room. The very moment I entered, the volume of the crowded room noticeably, dramatically dropped. Dozens of eyes darted toward me, quickly scanning my plain, unbranded clothes, silently calculating my obvious lack of net worth, and judging my presence. Uncle Frederick was the very first relative to approach the target. Frederick was a retired, highly arrogant investment banker who exclusively wore custom tweed jackets and treated absolutely everyone around him like a lowly subordinate. He held a heavy glass of expensive scotch in one hand, clapping me hard on the shoulder with a grip that was entirely too aggressive to be friendly. "Julian," he boomed, his voice echoing obnoxiously over the classical music playing in the corner. "Look who finally decided to grace us with his rare presence. I saw you pull up. Still driving that absolute junker, I see. Tell me, boy, are you still playing around with those little delivery trucks in the mud? The economy is incredibly tough right now. Maybe your brother Arthur can find a spot for you sorting envelopes in the mailroom of his new political campaign headquarters. It comes with health insurance." A few wealthy aunts and distant cousins standing nearby chuckled into their expensive drinks, clearly enjoying the public humiliation. I looked closely at Frederick's smug, flushed face. 10 years ago, his cruel words would have completely crushed my fragile spirit. Today, looking at a man whose entire identity was tied to a dying banking era, I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of pity for him. "The trucks are running just fine, Uncle Frederick," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, calm, and completely devoid of any defensive emotion. "You'd be genuinely surprised how much real, tangible value there is in actually getting things where they need to go on time, rather than just moving imaginary numbers around a spreadsheet." He snorted loudly, his face reddening slightly as he waved his hand dismissively, clearly annoyed by my lack of submission. "Yes, well, noble blue-collar work, I suppose. Someone has to do the heavy lifting for the rest of us." I moved away from him and navigated carefully through the dense sea of expensive designer suits and custom silk dresses. I nodded politely, engaging in the incredibly toxic, exhausting small talk that defined my family. Every single conversation was a thinly veiled, subtle interrogation about my meager salary, my supposedly terrible living conditions, and my glaring, embarrassing lack of a prestigious corporate title. Beatrice glided past me, smelling of an overpowering, incredibly expensive imported perfume. She offered me a tight, venomous, practiced smile but didn't say a single word to me, clearly annoyed that I had somehow managed to bypass her email blockades and show up. Arthur was holding court near the massive stone fireplace, loudly and aggressively discussing political polling numbers and corporate tax loopholes with my father's wealthy lawyer friends, making sure everyone knew exactly how important he was. Eventually, the grand antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed loudly, and my mother, dressed in a stunning, custom-made emerald gown that screamed old money, ushered everyone formally into the massive dining room. The seating arrangement was a masterclass in psychological warfare and family hierarchy. My father sat at the absolute head of the table, looking like a king ready to address his court. Arthur was seated immediately to his right, the position of the favored successor. Beatrice was seated to his left. The VIP relatives, the wealthy bankers, and the successful lawyers were clustered near the top of the table. I was purposefully relegated to the very far end, practically sitting near the swinging kitchen doors, seated next to distant, elderly cousins who barely spoke English and clearly didn't want to talk to me. The extravagant dinner commenced. Course after course of imported beluga caviar, rich truffle soup, and perfectly roasted meats were seamlessly served by the silent, efficient catering staff. The tension in my gut steadily began to coil tighter and tighter. I discreetly checked my watch beneath the table. It was almost time. I knew Marcus was currently in a high-rise office in New York, aggressively finalizing the mountain of legal paperwork with the elite investment bankers. The massive $40 million wire transfer was scheduled to hit our corporate accounts at any given minute. Then, the delicate porcelain dessert plates were cleared away by the staff. My father placed both of his hands flat on the polished mahogany table. The subtle hum of dozens of conversations instantly, obediently died. He picked up his heavy crystal wine glass, the rich red liquid catching the bright light of the chandelier overhead. He began his highly anticipated speech. He spoke beautifully and eloquently about the pristine Kensington legacy. He talked endlessly about duty, about the immense burden of upholding the family name, and about securing the financial and political future for the elite next generation. "Arthur," my father said, projecting his deep voice so every single person in the massive room could hear him perfectly, "your incredible dedication to the law and your upcoming, highly anticipated political campaign bring immeasurable pride to this family. To ensure your political war chest is fully, aggressively funded, the Nantucket estate and the primary aggressive stock portfolio are officially yours, effective immediately." The entire room erupted in thunderous applause. Arthur bowed his head in a display of sickening humility, raising his glass in a toast to his own greatness. "Beatrice," my father continued, his eyes shining with genuine pride, "your absolute brilliance in the field of public relations is unmatched in this city. Your massive education fund is now a fully vested, high-yield real estate trust, yours to control completely." More thunderous applause. Beatrice smiled radiantly, blowing a kiss to my father and raising her glass to the adoring room. I sat at the far, dark end of the table, completely still. I watched this grotesque, theatrical display of blatant nepotism and arrogance. I watched my parents literally buy the loyalty and affection of the children who perfectly fit their shallow corporate mold. My father paused. The heavy silence dragged on for a painfully, uncomfortably long moment. He slowly, deliberately turned his head. His cold gaze swept down the entire length of the long mahogany table, passing over the wealthy relatives, until his eyes finally locked onto mine at the very end. The immense pride completely vanished from his face. His expression hardened instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated, public disappointment. He opened his mouth, drawing a deep breath to deliver the final, devastating blow. He was about to try and destroy my life and my dignity in front of every single person I knew. I sat back deeply in my chair, the heavy weight of my phone resting in my pocket, and I calmly waited for the executioner to strike. My father took a long, slow, agonizing sip of his vintage Bordeaux, savoring the silence he had created in the room. He looked at me across that polished mahogany table as if I were a speck of unsightly dirt on his expensive imported Italian rug. He cleared his throat, the sound resonating through the ornate, chandelier-lit dining room like a brutal gavel strike in a courtroom. Every single relative, from the wealthiest uncle to the most distant, gossiping cousin, leaned in, their expressions a mix of predatory curiosity and cold, calculated judgment. "And finally," my father said, his voice dripping with such profound condescension that it practically coated the air in the room. He let the silence build, knowing every single eye was locked onto me, waiting for my inevitable humiliation. "We have observed your recent professional endeavors with significant concern, Julian. You have spent the better part of your 20s playing at being a businessman, dabbling in erratic logistics projects, while your siblings have been tirelessly building actual, tangible, and prestigious legacies. Your mother and I have held a very serious, long overdue discussion about your future. We have decided that it is in the absolute best interest of the Kensington Family Trust to withhold all major financial allocations from you, effective immediately. We are implementing a formal, indefinite freeze on all your potential assets until you can demonstrate a level of stability, visibility, and respectability that actually aligns with our family's long-standing standards. In short, stop the nonsense and get a real, respectable career. He didn't just cut me off. He systematically insulted my entire professional existence. He made it sound like I was a wayward, foolish child who needed to be disciplined by the iron fist of the family patriarch. My mother, who had been eerily silent up until this precise moment, leaned forward, her face twisted into a mask of feigned, suffocating concern. She constantly twisted her massive diamond wedding band, a nervous, telltale habit she had developed over years of lying through her teeth. "It really isn't a punishment, Julian," she whispered, her voice pitched loud enough for every person at the table to hear her performative pity. "We just think it is high time you finally made some traditional, stable, and visible life decisions. Startups and logistics experiments are just so incredibly unstable. We simply wouldn't want you to ruin the established Kensington family name with another embarrassing failure like that flower shop incident. We are doing this because we love you, dear." Beatrice chimed in immediately, her lips curling into a smug, triumphant smirk that I had been seeing since we were toddlers. "It's honestly for the best, Julian. You really, truly should focus on branding and image management. People in our circles take you so much more seriously when you don't look like you're constantly struggling to make your rent or driving a car that belongs in a scrapyard." Arthur added his own arrogant 2 cents, looking down his nose at me with a smirk. "Your work isn't really public or respected, Julian. It's incredibly hard for the board of advisors to evaluate your actual contributions when they don't exist in the real corporate world. If you had just applied yourself to law school like I suggested 5 years ago, we could have had a completely different, much more productive conversation tonight." I sat there perfectly, unnaturally still. My blood was boiling so hot it felt like liquid fire in my veins, but my outward expression remained a stone-cold, impenetrable mask. They had clearly rehearsed this entire performance. They had sat in that living room before I arrived, drinking, laughing, and coordinating this public execution. They wanted to see me break. They wanted to see me beg, to see me crawl back and promise to be the obedient, submissive Kensington son they had always wanted me to be. I placed my heavy silver fork down on the fine porcelain plate with deliberate, measured precision. The sound was deafening in the silence. "Just so I am absolutely crystal clear," I said, my voice quiet but radiating a steady, underlying power that made them blink. "You are formally cutting me off from the trust because I have chosen to build a career that doesn't strictly follow the rigid, outdated Kensington template?" My mother shifted uncomfortably in her high-backed chair, her smile wavering. "We aren't cutting you off, dear. We are just pausing things. No vacation property, no family fund stake, no access to the liquid resources. But we are always here for you if you change your mind and decide to join the firm." The room held its collective breath. They were waiting for me to explode. They were waiting for me to start shouting, to start pleading, to make a total fool of myself so they could say, "See? He's unstable and ungrateful." Instead, I looked at them one by one, with a gaze that felt like ice. I looked at my father's arrogant, tightening jaw, my mother's fake concern, Beatrice's spiteful, shallow eyes, and Arthur's smug, self-satisfied grin. And then I smiled. It wasn't a happy, joyful smile. It was the terrifying smile of a man who held the absolute winning hand in a rigged game. "Understood?" I said softly, the word echoing with a finality that made Arthur suddenly look uneasy. Then, my phone buzzed violently against my leg. It was the signal. Marcus was calling. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I didn't care about their ridiculous etiquette. I didn't care about their ancient, suffocating rules. I didn't care about being polite to people who had treated me like garbage for a decade. I stood up from the table, my heavy chair scraping harshly against the polished hardwood floor, a sound that made my mother flinch. "Really, Julian?" my father barked, his face turning an ugly, blotchy shade of deep red. "We are in the middle of a formal family dinner. Have you no decorum?" I ignored him entirely, my focus laser-sharp on the device in my hand. I pressed the phone to my ear and tapped the speaker button, ensuring the entire room would catch every word. "Marcus," I said, my voice ringing clearly through the silent, tense dining room. "Julian." Marcus's voice came through, energetic, crisp, and professional, completely unaware he had a live, horrified audience. "SoftBank just confirmed the wire. The $40 million is in our corporate account. The valuation is officially certified at $100 million pre-IPO. Goldman Sachs wants the press release finalized tonight. Also, the Tokyo team is asking if you're ready to officially expand into the Asian market next quarter. They need the final sign-off, CEO." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. It was the sound of reality crashing into their delusions. I looked at my father. His heavy crystal wine glass was hovering midair, completely forgotten. My mother's fork had stopped halfway to her open mouth, her hand trembling violently. Arthur's face went ghastly white, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were trying to find a hidden exit. Beatrice looked like she had just witnessed a horrific car accident in slow motion. I held the phone up for a moment, then looked back at Marcus. "That's fantastic news, Marcus. Let's schedule a team call for the morning. Tell Goldman I'll send over my final notes tonight. I'll be ready for the Tokyo expansion." "Got it, CEO," Marcus said cheerfully. "Talk soon." I ended the call and tucked the phone back into my pocket. I looked around the room. The silence was still absolute, but the atmosphere had shifted from smug, wealthy superiority to absolute, paralyzing existential terror. I walked back to my seat, pulled it out, and sat down. My family looked like they had just seen a ghost or perhaps the manifestation of their own monumental failure. The silence lasted for what felt like an eternity, an infinite loop of shock and disbelief. Then Aunt Clara, the only person at that massive table with a spine and a genuine, beating soul, broke the tension with a sharp, ringing, melodic laugh. "Well," she said, raising her champagne flute toward me with a genuine twinkle in her eyes, "I think that deserves a real, genuine toast. To the CEO of the family, finally." I caught her eye and gave her a small, sincere nod. She had always been the one relative who treated me like a human being instead of a line item. My mother was the first to recover, her survival instincts kicking in immediately. Her face transformed in a fraction of a second, moving from pure shock to a sickly, sugary, pathetic sweetness. "Julian, darling," she said, her voice breathy and desperate, trying to save her image. "Why didn't you tell us? We were so worried about you." My father leaned forward, his arrogance replaced by a sudden, intense, predatory hunger. "SoftBank? As in the SoftBank? And Goldman's involved? Julian, we should have had this conversation much earlier. If you had just told us your company was doing this well, we could have coordinated a family investment. Perhaps we could have helped you scale even faster." The man who had just finished telling me I wasn't worth a single dollar now wanted to be my primary investor, hoping to leech off the success he had spent years trying to destroy. The audacity was breathtaking. Arthur jumped in, his voice slightly higher pitched than usual, trying to regain his grip on the narrative. "Goldman Sachs, huh? That's real institutional weight. We could position this as a Kensington Family Innovation Initiative. I have high-level donors who would love a tech-forward story to attach to my campaign platform. This is absolutely perfect for the messaging." Beatrice wasn't far behind, already spinning the propaganda in her head. "We're organizing a high-profile healthcare reform panel next month, Julian. Brian, my boss, would love to feature you. We could brand your work as part of the campaign's forward-looking agenda. It's absolutely perfect for the press." They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at my bank account. They were looking at my influence. They were looking at me as a strategic asset to be exploited, not a son to be loved. I took a long, slow, deliberate sip of my wine, watching them scramble like rats in a sinking ship. I let them sweat for a minute, letting the sheer desperation of their pathetic pivots wash over me. "I thought you said startups were too risky," I said, my voice calm and conversational, cutting through their excitement. No one laughed this time. For a moment, they looked genuinely embarrassed by their own naked greed. Then, as if on a timer, they all started talking at once, trying to explain, trying to rewrite the history of the last 20 minutes to make themselves look like supportive, visionary mentors. My mother reached across the table, her hand gleaming with expensive, heavy rings, and tried to touch mine. "Sweetheart, I know we've been cautious, but you have to understand we were just worried about your future. Startups fail, Julian. We just didn't want you to get hurt by the harsh realities of the market." I pulled my hand away gently, refusing to let her touch me. "You were worried?" I asked, my voice rising slightly. "That's funny because no one has asked how I was doing in 10 years. You weren't worried about me. You were embarrassed by me." Their faces tightened. They didn't like the naked truth. They preferred their polite, curated versions of reality where they were always the heroes. "You've spent a decade minimizing every single thing I do," I continued, keeping my voice steady and cold. "You laughed when I said I was building software. You called it a hobby. You told your friends I was between jobs while I was leading logistics transformation pilots across 10 states. Arthur cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Come on, Julian. You know we were just teasing. It's a family thing." "No," I said firmly, the words slamming into the room. "It wasn't a family thing. It was a power thing. You were diminishing me because it made you feel more comfortable in your own success. And now that you know there's a $100 million valuation involved, suddenly I'm not embarrassing anymore. Now, I'm a strategic asset to be branded." Beatrice looked genuinely hurt, or at least she played the part with theatrical excellence. "That's not fair, Julian. We've always believed in you." "Really?" I raised an eyebrow, challenging her. "Name my company." Silence. They looked at each other, panicking. They didn't even know what I did for a living. "It's SwiftRoute," I said. "We optimized last-mile delivery for medical supply chains using AI predictive modeling. We currently operate in 27 states with 213 distribution partners and a 96% fulfillment success rate." My father blinked, his brain finally processing the scale of it. That's impressive." "Yes," I said. "It is." He straightened his expensive tie, slipping back into his familiar boardroom mode. "Well, then we should revisit your position in the trust. Clearly, the situation has evolved. We can make adjustments." "No," I replied, my voice sharp as a surgical scalpel. "Nothing has evolved in the last 20 minutes except your perception of my net worth." "You're overreacting, Julian," my mother said, her voice trembling. "No, I'm responding," I said. "There is a massive difference between the two." Arthur opened his mouth to try and negotiate again, but I held up a hand. "Let me be extremely clear. I am not looking for a family stake, I am not looking for board seats, and I am certainly not looking for political co-branding. SwiftRoute is fully funded. Our board is full. Our investors believe in our vision because they saw it and supported it before it was valuable. You didn't." Beatrice's lips tightened into a thin, angry line. "So what now? We're just not part of your success story." I looked at her, then at the table, at the crystal, the silverware, the people who had never once made room for me until the room was full of money. "You're not part of this story," I said, "because you didn't want to be when it actually mattered." I stood up. "I have a team call in the morning. Real stakeholders. Real believers. So, if you'll excuse me." "Wait," my father said, rising halfway from his chair. "We should talk this through, Julian. We are family." "We did," I said, walking toward the door. "Over Seabass and betrayal." As I reached the hallway, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Marcus. "Forbes cover confirmed. Tokyo expansion greenlit. Congrats, CEO." I smiled, tucked the phone into my pocket, and walked out the door, never looking back. The days following that dinner were a blur of frenetic, desperate activity. My phone was constant, ringing with missed calls and carefully worded, groveling text messages from my brother, my sister, and my father. They had gone from ignoring me to being absolutely obsessed with me. It was pathetic to watch. Arthur sent a long, rambling text about exciting crossover potential. Beatrice left a voicemail about how she had always admired my drive and how we needed to reset our relationship. Even my father sent an email titled simply Discussion Proposal. I didn't answer a single one of them. I blocked every single number. But I did respond to one message. Marcus had sent me a draft of our press release, our $100 million valuation, our expansion into Japan, and at the end, he included a short paragraph I had quietly asked for weeks ago. We are proud to announce the launch of the Kensington Foundation, a $5 million initiative supporting young women in supply chain tech, especially those from underrepresented communities. I chose the name not to honor my family, but to reclaim it. For years, Kensington had been a name that was used to exclude me from family trusts, investments, and dinner table conversations. Now, it would be the name that opened doors for girls like me, girls who didn't look the part, didn't talk the part, but saw systems and patterns and believed they could actually fix things. The announcement event was held at our Boston headquarters. No grand ballroom, no political guests, no pretentious people with champagne flutes. Just the Swift Route team, a few local educators, and a group of high school girls from underserved schools who had been invited to tour our logistics floor. I watched their faces light up as my engineers showed them how we modeled delivery failures, how data could move medicine, and how algorithms could change real-world outcomes. That night, after the event, I got a text from my mother. It was the first time she had ever called my work extraordinary. She asked if I would consider letting the family host a fundraiser for the foundation at the Vineyard House. I stared at the screen for a long time. It was the validation I had spent my entire childhood chasing. But it felt completely empty. She still wanted to use the house they had excluded me from for years to host a fundraiser that would make them look good to the public. I didn't respond to her text. Instead, I took a cab to that small, dusty flower shop on the edge of Cambridge. Mrs. Reed, the owner, still remembered me perfectly. She was the first person to believe I wasn't just good with computers, but someone who could solve real-world problems. I handed her an envelope with instructions and a business card. The next day, a massive, stunning bouquet of white lilies was delivered to the Kensington estate, addressed specifically to my mother. The card inside read, "Thank you for your offer. The foundation already has a venue, a warehouse. The exact same one where I built everything you once called a phase. Warmly, Julian." I knew that would hurt. It wasn't the kind of hurt you could sue over. It was the kind of hurt that cut straight through their pride and exposed the emptiness of their gestures. A month later, I was invited to speak at a public high school in Baltimore, an all-girls STEM academy tucked between auto shops and boarded-up warehouses. They didn't roll out a red carpet. There were no camera crews, just a folding chair, a modest auditorium, and 50 girls with notebooks and sharp, intelligent eyes. I told them about Swift Route. I told them about the years I spent coding in a freezing garage while delivering pizzas just to pay for server space. I told them about the logistics failures that delayed insulin shipments and how fixing those failures meant saving real, human lives. Afterward, during the Q&A, a girl in the second row raised her hand. She couldn't have been older than 15. She had braids, chipped nail polish, and a look of intense, quiet determination that reminded me too much of my younger self. "My parents think logistics is for truck drivers," she said. "They want me to be a doctor or a lawyer, something serious. Did your family ever support you?" I hesitated. The truth hung in the air, heavy and raw. "No," I said finally. "They didn't. Not at first. Not when it mattered." She looked down, her shoulders sagging like I had confirmed her worst fear. "But," I continued, my voice steady, "what I learned is that sometimes the people closest to us can't see us. Not because we're invisible, but because they only recognize reflections of themselves. You don't have to fight them. You just have to build something they can't deny. You have to build something so real, and so entirely your own, that their misunderstanding becomes completely irrelevant. She nodded slowly. I knew she got it. That night, back in my loft overlooking the Boston Harbor, I realized I had finally won. My father tried to launch a legal challenge against my board, but he was silenced by the SoftBank partners. The Kensington brand was now, for the first time in history, actually doing something good, and they didn't have the power to stop me. The final blow to their influence came from an unexpected place. The campaign that Arthur was running for Congress had been aggressively courting my endorsement because he thought it would look good to have a tech-forward family member on board. When he finally realized I wasn't going to play ball, he tried to leak a story to the press that I was a rebellious son who was mismanaging the Kensington Foundation's assets. He didn't realize that I had prepared for this. I had kept every email, every text, and every digital receipt from Beatrice since she started blocking my invitations. I didn't need to leak them. I just had the Foundation's legal team send an official letter to the major newspapers stating that I would be releasing the full history of my exclusion if the harassment from the Kensington family didn't stop immediately. That was the end of it. The Kensington legacy couldn't handle a scandal involving a CEO who was currently on the cover of Forbes. Arthur dropped the campaign talking points overnight. I didn't care about the political fallout. I didn't care about their reputation. I only cared about the life I had built. I hosted a quiet dinner for my team at the warehouse office where it all began. No press, no gala, no pretentious people with champagne flutes. Just the people who believed in me from the start. As everyone was leaving, Marcus handed me one last delivery. It was a simple bouquet of peonies. No card, just a look between us, an understanding. I placed them by the window next to a framed photo of that warehouse in its earliest days. Concrete floor, cardboard desks, no heat, no furniture, just a vision. That's what I built. Not just a company, a legacy, my own. I finally understood that the pain I suffered wasn't a curse. It was the forge. It was what made me capable of building something that couldn't be touched by the Kensington name. As I stand here today, looking back at that dinner table, I don't feel anger anymore. Anger requires a connection, and I've severed that connection completely. I have found a new family. A family of people who build, who solve, and who care about the world. If you're listening to this, and you're struggling to prove yourself to people who are determined to keep you small, remember this: your value is not defined by their vision of you. You don't need their permission to be extraordinary. You just need the courage to build something they can't ignore. The most powerful revenge isn't tearing them down. It's becoming so successful, so impactful, and so genuinely happy that their judgment no longer matters. Their world is small, their vision is narrow, and their legacy is built on sand. But the world you're building, that's made of steel. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you had to walk away from people who were supposed to support you? Share your story in the comments below. I read them, and I promise you are not alone. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. It means more to me than you know. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey. We're just getting started.